The wind screams past Ilara's ears, a chorus to the frantic drumming of hooves against the parched earth. Branches whip at her face, leaving stinging trails on skin already stretched taut with terror. Behind her, in the shadowed recesses of her mind, rides the image of Thorn, his face a mask of fury, his voice a promise of pain. But physically, she risks a glance over her shoulder, nothing but dust devils dancing in the oppressive heat. For now, the horse beneath her, a powerful bay, stumbles, its breath coming in ragged, near-human gasps. She murmurs desperate apologies, urging it on, her own lungs burning in sympathy. This animal is her only hope, her only sin, in this desperate bid for freedom. It's a magnificent creature, too fine for a woman like her to even dream of riding, let alone stealing. But Thorn's house, his rules, his heavy hand, they left her no choice but the unthinkable. Every beat of its heart against her legs is a countdown. Either she finds sanctuary, or Thorn finds her. Or another, colder dread begins to whisper, the owner of this very fine, very stolen horse finds her first. The thought is a fresh spur, urging her onward into the desolate, unforgiving landscape. She has no water, no food, only the threadbare dress on her back and the growing terror that she has traded one cage for another. The sun climbs, a merciless eye in the vast blue. The stolen horse, slick with sweat, begins to falter more noticeably now, its powerful strides shortening, its head dropping. Ilara's own strength is nearly gone, her vision blurring. Just as despair threatens to engulf her, a figure materializes from the shimmering heat haze ahead. A rider, tall and straight in the saddle, moving with an easy grace that speaks of long hours spent traversing these wild lands. As he draws closer, sunlight glints off something on his chest, a small metallic star, a lawman. Her heart plummets, a stone cast into an abyss. Her desperate flight has led her from a cruel husband straight into the impartial arms of the law. The horse beneath her gives a final shuddering sigh and comes to a halt, its sides heaving. The lawman is upon her before she can even think to turn, his shadow falling over her like a sentence. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The lawman dismounts, his movements economical and unhurried. He's older than she first thought, his face etched with the sun and wind, but his eyes, when they meet hers, are not cold. They are a steady, assessing blue, taking in her ragged appearance, her visible fear, the exhausted state of the horse. "That's a fine animal you're riding, ma'am," he says, his voice calm, a low rumble that doesn't quite match the stern expectation of his badge. Pushed him a little hard, looks like. Ilara can only nod, her throat too tight for words. He reaches out a hand, not towards her, but to the horse, running a knowing palm along its lathered neck. "This here is Chance," he says almost gently, "and he belongs to me." With those words, Ilara's fragile world tilted, her desperate gamble seemingly lost, her future now resting entirely in the hands of this stranger whose property she'd taken, this kind-voiced lawman whose trust she had, by necessity, betrayed. The marshal, Silas McBride, had been tracking the familiar gait of his horse, Chance, for the better part of the morning, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. It wasn't like Chance to wander, and Silas had a feeling, cold and sharp, that this was no ordinary straying. When he'd finally crested the rise and seen the distant figure, slumped and desperate, atop his bay, the unease had sharpened into a grim certainty. Horse theft was a hanging offense in some territories, and at the very least, a serious crime everywhere. Yet, as he'd drawn closer, the thief had resolved into the shape of a woman, young and clearly terrified, her clothes torn, a haunted look in her eyes that spoke of more than just the fear of capture. He'd recognized the signs of desperation, of a soul pushed to the brink. The way she clung to Chance, not with a thief's mastery, but with a drowning person's grip on a lifeline. Her face, when she finally looked up, was smudged with dirt and tears, a livid bruise purpling along her jawline, another fading yellow on her temple. These weren't the marks of a hard ride. Silas had seen enough of the world, enough of its casual cruelties, to read the story etched on her skin. Marshal Silas McBride, he'd introduced himself, keeping his voice even, though a slow anger simmered beneath the surface, not at her, but at what might have driven her to this. He watched her swallow, her eyes darting as if seeking an escape that didn't exist. "Ilara," she'd whispered, her voice hoarse. "Ilara Thorne." Thorne. The name was unfamiliar, but the possessive way she said it, followed by the shadow that crossed her face, told him enough. He led his horse, with Ilara still atop it, too weak to dismount on her own, towards the meager shade of a rocky outcrop. He offered her his canteen, and she drank like a woman who hadn't seen water in days, her hands trembling. He learned little more from her on the slow ride back towards the small town of Redemption, where he served as marshal. She was mostly silent, lost in a daze of exhaustion and fear. He didn't press. The evidence of her hardship was plain enough. His horse, Chance, seemed to sense her fragility, walking with a steadier, gentler pace than usual, occasionally turning his head to nuzzle her knee as if offering comfort. Silas knew his horse. Chance was a good judge of character. Redemption wasn't much, a handful of dusty streets and clapboard buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, indifferent wilderness. It was a town that lived up to its name for some, a place of last chances and new beginnings. For others, it was just another spot to pass through, or a place where old prejudices died hard. As they rode down Main Street, Silas was acutely aware of the curtains twitching, the eyes following them. Mrs. Brusen Straight. Henderson, peering from behind the counter of the general store, her gaze sharp and disapproving. Jedediah Smith, the blacksmith, paused in his work, his expression unreadable. News of the marshal returning with a strange woman on his own horse, a horse that had clearly been missing, would spread through Redemption like wildfire. He thought of Thorne, the name she'd given, a husband most likely, a cruel one, judging by her state, a man who might come looking for his property. The law was clear on runaway wives, just as it was on horse thieves. But Silas had always found the letter of the law to be a blunt instrument, often needing the guidance of conscience to strike true. He remembered a conversation with the circuit judge last spring, a dry, humorless man who'd once said, "Justice is blind, Marshal. Your job is to weigh the facts, not the tears." Silas had disagreed then, silently, and he disagreed now. Sometimes the tears were the most important fact of all. He helped Ilara dismount in front of the small stone building that served as both his office and his modest living quarters. Her legs nearly buckled, and he caught her arm, his touch firm but gentle. She flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but he felt it. He led her inside, away from the prying eyes of the town. The interior was Spartan, a scarred wooden desk, a gun rack, a cot in the back room. It was a lonely place, reflecting his own solitary life, but for Ilara, after what she'd clearly endured, he hoped it might, for a short while, feel like a sanctuary. He settled her into the only chair, a worn leather one that had seen better days, and then went to tend to Chance, his mind already working, trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle he knew would only become more complicated. He could hear the low murmur of gossip already starting to build outside, like the hum of locusts before a storm. The town would have its opinions, and soon, he suspected, Mr. Thorne might arrive to voice his. Silas returned to find Ilara huddled in the chair, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to ward off a chill, though the air in the small office was warm. He offered her a tin cup of water, which she took with a trembling hand. "You need to rest," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "and eat something. I don't have much, but—" "Why are you being kind?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the dusty floorboards. "I stole your horse." Silas leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "You were desperate, Mrs. Thorne. Desperation makes people do things they wouldn't ordinarily." He paused. "And I've seen men steal for a sight less." He didn't mention the bruises again, not yet. He just let his gaze rest on her, hoping to convey a measure of safety. "As for kindness," he continued, a faint, wry smile touching his lips, "maybe it's in short supply, so I try to use it when I can." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, perhaps a dawning, fragile hope, quickly overshadowed by fear. "He'll come for me," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if stating an undeniable, terrible fact. "Thorne, he always finds me." "Is he your husband?" Silas asked, keeping his tone neutral. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. He won't let me go." "Folks in Redemption will talk," Silas said, more to prepare her than to threaten. "They saw you ride in on my horse. They'll have questions. I'll have to answer some of them." He pushed himself off the desk. "For now, you're under my protection. The back room has a cot. It's not much, but it's safe." Ilara looked up at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something other than terror in her gaze. It was a profound weariness, but also a hesitant, questioning gratitude. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that helping this woman was going to bring trouble to his door. But looking at her, at the map of suffering etched on her young face, he also knew he had no other choice. His duty as a lawman was to uphold the law, yes, but his duty as a man, as a decent human being, was to protect the vulnerable. And Ilara Thorne was the most vulnerable soul he had encountered in a long, long time. The next few days settled into a quiet, uneasy rhythm. Silas made Ilara stay in the back room of the jailhouse, mostly for her own protection from the curious and judgmental eyes of Redemption's townsfolk. He brought her meals from the town's small eatery, simple fare that she ate with a gratitude that tugged at something in him. He made sure Chance was well tended, and Ilara, when she thought Silas wasn't looking, would sometimes slip out to the small corral behind the jail and speak softly to the horse, her hand stroking his velvet nose. It was clear she felt a bond with the animal that had carried her to tentative safety, and a deep remorse for having taken him. Silas made discreet inquiries. Redemption was small, but news traveled. No one had heard of a man named Thorne in the immediate vicinity, but that meant little. The territory was vast, and a determined man could cover a lot of ground. He sent a wire to the marshal in a larger town further west, a man he trusted, asking if he knew of any warrants or missing person reports for an Ilara Thorne, or any information on a man named Thorne known for unpleasantness. He kept the inquiry vague. During the long evenings, after the town had settled into a deceptive quiet, Silas would sometimes find himself talking with Ilara. Not about her husband, not directly, he didn't push. Instead, he spoke of the land, of the changing seasons, of small, everyday things. He learned she was from back east, orphaned young, and had come west with Thorne after a hasty marriage she clearly regretted. She spoke little of her life with him, but the silences were filled with an unspoken pain that Silas could almost feel. He saw the way she flinched if he moved too quickly, the way her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings, as if expecting a blow to fall at any moment. One evening, as a cool breeze rustled the cottonwoods outside, Ilara was mending a tear in one of Silas's shirts, her stitches small and neat. It was a task she'd taken upon herself, a quiet way of repaying his kindness. "You're a good seamstress," Silas observed, watching her nimble fingers. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. "My mother taught me." "Before." She didn't finish the sentence. "Before Thorne?" he asked gently. She nodded, her head bent low over her work. "He didn't like me doing things that weren't for him." A cold anger tightened Silas's chest. He'd seen men like Thorne before, men who found their strength in breaking others, especially women. A man like that, Silas said, his voice carefully controlled, doesn't deserve a woman's care. Ilara looked up, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "But the law says I'm his wife." "The law says many things, Ilara," Silas replied, meeting her gaze. "It doesn't always say what's right." That was the first time he'd used her first name without the formal Mrs. Thorne, and she noticed. A small, almost imperceptible softening in her expression, a tiny seed of trust beginning to sprout in the barren ground of her fear. The test he'd anticipated arrived sooner than he expected. A circuit preacher, a fire and brimstone man named Reverend Blackwood, passed through Redemption and quickly picked up on the scent of perceived sin. He'd heard the whispers, the marshal, sheltering a runaway wife, a horse thief no less. Blackwood, puffed up with self-righteousness, confronted Silas in front of the general store, his voice ringing out for all to hear. "Marshal McBride, I hear you harbor a Jezebel in your jailhouse, a woman who has broken sacred vows and stolen property. The good book is clear on such matters. She should be returned to her husband, chastened and repentant." Several townsfolk had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Silas felt Ilara, who had been in the office nearby, shrink back from the doorway. He stepped forward, placing himself between the preacher and the jail. "Reverend," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "The good book also speaks of compassion and mercy. And as for this woman, she is under my protection while I investigate certain claims. The matter of the horse is between me and her. And her husband, should he appear, will also have questions to answer." Blackwood sputtered, "Questions? He is the aggrieved party. She has wronged him." "That," Silas said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd, his eyes lingering for a moment on Mrs. Henderson's pursed lips, "remains to be seen. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual duties to attend to." He turned his back on the preacher and walked into his office, the crowd slowly dispersing, muttering amongst themselves. Ilara was standing by the window, her face pale. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Silas said grimly. "That was just a preacher. Thorn, if he's what I think he is, will be a different kind of storm." But he had made his stand, not just to the town, but to himself. He was no longer just investigating a horse theft. He was protecting a life. Days turned into a week, then nearly 2. Ilara slowly began to lose some of the haunted look in her eyes. She started to help Silas with small tasks around the office, tidying up, brewing coffee, even copying out notices in her neat hand. She still startled easily, but the constant, trembling fear that had consumed her began to recede, replaced by a cautious watchfulness. She spoke more freely now, not of the horrors of her marriage, but of small memories from her childhood, of dreams she once had, simple dreams of a small cottage with a garden, of peace. Silas listened, his quiet presence a balm to her wounded spirit. He found himself looking forward to their quiet evenings, the shared silences as comfortable as the occasional conversations. He saw her strength, her resilience, the gentle nature that Thorn had tried so brutally to extinguish. He began to understand that his protective instincts were deepening into something more personal, something that made the thought of her husband finding her, of her being forced to return to that life, an unbearable prospect. The wire he'd sent finally brought a response. His friend, Marshal John Dawes from Prescott, confirmed no official warrants for Ilara, but he did know of a man named Marcus Thorn, a bully with a quick temper and a mean streak. Dawes's message read, rumored to be heavy-handed with his livestock and, some whisper, with his late first wife, though nothing was ever proven. Last seen heading east, asking after a runaway woman matching the description you gave. Be wary, Silas. Thorn has money and a vindictive nature. Silas read the telegram, his jaw tightening. So, Thorn was indeed the man he suspected, and he was actively searching. The fragile peace they had found was about to be shattered. He folded the paper slowly, a cold resolve hardening within him. He had to prepare Ilara. He had to prepare himself. That evening, he told her about the telegram. She listened, her face paling, her hands twisting in her lap. The old terror returned to her eyes, stark and raw. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I knew it." "Yes," Silas said, his voice gentle but firm. "He likely is. But this time, Ilara, you won't be facing him alone." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "What can you do? I'm his wife. I stole your horse. The law is on his side." "The law," Silas said, leaning forward, "is meant to protect the innocent, not to shield the guilty. We'll find a way, Ilara. I won't let him take you back to that." He saw the conflict in her face, the desperate desire to believe him, warring with years of ingrained fear and helplessness. I don't want to cause you trouble, Marshal. You've been so kind." "This isn't about trouble, Ilara," he said. "It's about what's right." He saw a tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. He resisted the urge to reach out, to offer comfort in a way that might be misconstrued or frighten her further. Instead, he offered the only comfort he truly could, his unwavering resolve. "We'll face him together." The waiting was the hardest part. Every rider who approached redemption, every distant cloud of dust, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Ilara. Silas watched her, his own tension carefully masked. He made sure his colt was clean and oiled, his rifle close at hand. He tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, going about his duties, but a heightened awareness thrummed beneath the surface. He found himself observing Ilara more closely, noticing the way the light caught the auburn tints in her hair when she stood by the window, the quiet grace in her movements as she tidied the office, the way her lips curved in a small, shy smile when chance nuzzled her hand. These small observations were like kindling, feeding a warmth in his chest that had been dormant for too long. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his heart guarded after losses of his own years ago. But Ilara, with her vulnerability and her quiet strength, was chipping away at those defenses. One afternoon, Ilara was tending to the small patch of wildflowers she'd encouraged to grow by the side of the jailhouse, a tiny splash of color in the dusty landscape. Silas watched her from his desk, a rare moment of peace settling over him. "You have a gentle touch with growing things," he remarked. She looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes and made his breath catch. "My mother loved flowers," she said softly. "She always said they were God's way of reminding us there's beauty even in harsh places." The moment was broken by the arrival of a dust-covered rider, pulling up sharply in front of the office. Not Thorne, Silas noted with a flicker of relief, but a rough-looking man with shifty eyes. "Marshal McBride," the man called out, his voice raspy. "I'm McBride," Silas said, stepping out onto the porch, his hand resting near his holster. Ilara had frozen, her smile vanishing. "Got a message for you," the man said, dismounting. He fumbled in his saddlebag and produced a sealed envelope. "From a Mr. Thorne. He's holed up at the saloon in Blackstone, about a day's ride from here. Says he expects you to deliver his wife and his property, meaning the horse she stole, to him, pronto. Or he'll come fetch 'em himself, and it won't be pleasant for anyone involved, especially not for redemption." Silas took the envelope, his expression unreadable. "Tell Mr. Thorne I received his message." The man smirked. He also said to tell the woman that he's looking forward to correcting her ways. A cold fury surged through Silas. He saw Ilara flinch as if struck. He kept his voice level. "You've delivered your message. You can go." The man, perhaps sensing the dangerous edge in Silas's calm, didn't linger. He mounted up and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and palpable menace in his wake. Silas turned to Ilara. She was pale as death, her eyes wide with a terror he hadn't seen since the day he found her. "He knows I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's close." "He is," Silas confirmed, his gaze hard. "And he's made his intentions clear." He tore open the envelope. The note inside was brief and arrogant, reiterating the messenger's threat, demanding Ilara's immediate return, and referring to her as my runaway property. "This isn't just about a horse anymore, Ilara," Silas said, crushing the note in his fist. "This is about your life. Your freedom." He looked at her, his decision already made. "He wants you delivered. Well, he'll get a confrontation he didn't bargain for." Ilara stared at him, a mixture of fear and dawning hope in her eyes. You would do that? For me?" "I swore an oath to uphold justice, Ilara," Silas said, his voice resonating with conviction. "And sometimes, justice means standing against a man like Thorne, no matter the cost." He paused, then added more softly, "And yes, I would do it for you." A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. This time, he did reach out, his calloused thumb gently brushing it away. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, the last of her hesitation seemed to fall away, replaced by a resolute courage that mirrored his own. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "We don't wait for him to come here," Silas said, his mind already working. "We ride to Blackstone. We face him on my terms, not his." It was a risk, taking her closer to Thorne, but it was better than letting Thorne bring the fight to redemption, where innocent people might get caught in the crossfire, and where Thorne might feel emboldened by a familiar setting if he'd been there before. "I'll wire Dawes in Prescott. Let him know what's happening. Maybe he can send a deputy, or at least be ready if things go sour." "I'll go with you," Ilara said, her chin lifting. "I'm not his property. I won't hide anymore." Silas looked at her, seeing not the terrified woman he'd found on the plains, but a woman finding her strength, her voice. "All right, Ilara," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Let's go show Mr. Thorne what justice in this territory really looks like." The ride to Blackstone was tense. Silas rode his sturdy gelding, Buck, while Ilara rode Chance, the horse that had become a symbol of her desperate flight and her unexpected sanctuary. She rode with a newfound straightness in her spine. Her eyes, though still wary, held a spark of determination. Silas had wired Marshal Dawes, outlining his intentions and requesting any support Dawes could offer, even if it was just to be aware of the situation. He knew he was stepping outside the strict bounds of his jurisdiction by confronting Thorne in Blackstone, but Thorne had issued a threat that extended to Redemption and to Ilara, who was under Silas's protection. That made it his business. They spoke little on the journey. The landscape was harsh, reflecting the grimness of their purpose. Silas found his gaze often drifting to Ilara. He admired her courage. Many women, after enduring what she had, would have crumbled. But Ilara, though scarred, was not broken. She was, in fact, growing stronger before his very eyes. He realized, with a startling clarity, that his feelings for her had deepened beyond mere protection or admiration. He cared for her, deeply and unequivocally. The thought was both a comfort and a burden, adding another layer of personal stake to the coming confrontation. Blackstone was a rougher, larger town than Redemption, its main street lined with saloons and gambling dens that hummed with a coarse energy even in the daytime. Thorne, Silas knew, would feel at home in such a place. As they rode into town, Silas felt the familiar prickle of eyes on them, the curious, the indifferent, the predatory. He located the saloon Thorne's messenger had named, the Gilded Cage, a gaudy, two-story establishment from which spilled the sounds of tinny piano music and raucous laughter. "Stay close," Silas murmured to Ilara, his hand instinctively going to the butt of his colt. She nodded, her face pale but set. "I'm ready." Silas dismounted, then helped Ilara down. He looped Chance's reins over the hitching post, giving the horse a reassuring pat. "Wait here with him," he told Ilara. "If there's trouble, you ride. Ride hard and don't look back. Head for Prescott. Dawes will help you." "No," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I'm not running anymore, Silas. I'll face him with you." He looked at her, saw the unwavering resolve in her eyes, and knew arguing would be pointless. It was her fight as much as his. "All right," he said, his heart swelling with a fierce pride. "But stay behind me." He pushed open the bat-wing doors of the Gilded Cage. The saloon was dimly lit, filled with smoke and the smell of stale beer and cheap perfume. A dozen or so men were scattered around tables or leaning against the long bar. Silas scanned the room, his gaze finally settling on a large, florid-faced man holding court at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey and a half-empty glass before him. The man was dressed in expensive, if somewhat ostentatious, clothes. He had an air of arrogant authority, and his eyes, small and mean, swept over Silas and then Ilara, who had followed him in. A cruel, possessive smile spread across his face. Marcus Thorne. "Well, well," Thorne boomed, his voice unpleasantly loud, drawing the attention of everyone in the saloon. "If it isn't my wayward wife, and Marshal McBride, I presume. I appreciate you delivering my property, Marshal. Saves me the trouble of coming to that pathetic excuse for a town you call Redemption." Several of Thorne's companions, rough-looking men who had the look of hired muscle, chuckled. Silas moved further into the room, Ilara a step behind him. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his demeanor calm but radiating an unmistakable authority. "Mr. Thorne," Silas said, his voice even, cutting through the saloon's noise. "Ilara is not your property. She's a free woman, and she's not going anywhere with you." Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. "Is that so, Marshal? She is my wife, bound by law and God, and she stole my horse, or rather yours, which makes her a common thief. You're harboring a criminal, McBride." "The only criminal I see here," Thorne, Silas said, his voice hardening, "is a man who abuses his wife. I have it on good authority that you have a reputation for cruelty, and Ilara bears the marks of your displeasure." Thorne slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. "Lies. She's hysterical. A disobedient, ungrateful woman. She needs a firm hand, and I intend to provide it." He started to rise, his face contorted with rage. His companions tensed, their hands moving towards their guns. "I wouldn't advise that, Thorn," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. His hand was now resting on the butt of his Colt. The saloon had gone silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. It was Ilara who spoke next, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the sudden stillness. "He's lying," she said, stepping out from behind Silas to face Thorn directly. The men at the bar, the painted women, all turned to look at her. "Marcus Thorn is a cruel, violent man. He beat me, he starved me, he treated me worse than an animal. I ran to save my life." Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the onlookers. "I took Marshal McBride's horse because I had no other choice. It was that or die at his hands." Thorn lunged towards her. "You lying little." Silas moved faster than Thorn could have anticipated. He stepped in front of Ilara, his arm shooting out, his hand catching Thorn's wrist in an iron grip. At the same time, his Colt seemed to leap into his other hand, leveled not at Thorn but at Thorn's companions, who had half risen from their chairs. "Hold it right there," Silas barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "This is between me and Thorn. Anyone else moves, and they'll answer to me." Thorn struggled in Silas's grip, his face purpling with rage. "You have no authority here, McBride. This is Blackstone." "Maybe not," Silas acknowledged grimly, "but I have a duty to protect an innocent woman from a brute. And you, Thorn, are a brute." He tightened his grip on Thorn's wrist, and the larger man winced. Suddenly, the batwing doors creaked open again, and two men stepped inside. One was Marshal John Dawes from Prescott, a star pinned to his vest, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. The other was his deputy. "Looks like we got here just in time, Silas," Dawes said, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the scene. "Heard there might be a disturbance involving a Mr. Thorn. Seems the rumors were true." Thorn's face fell. The fight seemed to drain out of him as he saw the new arrivals. His companions, seeing the odds suddenly shift, sank back into their chairs, their hands moving away from their guns. "Marshal Dawes," Silas said, relief evident in his voice, though his grip on Thorn didn't slacken. "Glad you could make it." "Always happy to assist a fellow lawman, especially when he's dealing with vermin like Thorn," Dawes said, his eyes cold as he looked at the now subdued man. "I've been wanting a word with you myself, Thorn. Seems there are some old accounts in Prescott that need settling, questions about your first wife's untimely accident." Thorn paled visibly. That was all cleared up." "Not to my satisfaction," Dawes said grimly. "And now, adding abuse and threatening a woman under Marshal McBride's protection, I think it's time you had a long talk with the circuit judge." He nodded to his deputy. "Cuff him." As the deputy moved to restrain Thorn, the man shot a look of pure hatred at Ilara. "You'll pay for this, you ungrateful witch. You'll never be free of me." Ilara met his gaze, no longer with fear, but with a quiet, steely resolve. "I already am free of you, Marcus," she said, her voice steady. "You have no power over me anymore." Silas released Thorn's wrist, and the deputy snapped handcuffs on him. Thorn, sputtering threats and curses, was hauled out of the saloon. His companions, seeing their employer arrested, quickly made themselves scarce. The tension in the gilded cage slowly dissipated. Marshal Dawes walked over to Silas and Ilara, a smile on his face. "Good work, Silas. You handled that well." He looked at Ilara with respect. "And you, Mum, it took courage to stand up to him like that." Ilara managed a small, watery smile. "Marshal McBride gave me that courage." Silas felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, and saw not the victim but the survivor. She had faced her tormentor and found her voice. The law, in its often convoluted way, had finally bent towards justice. The immediate aftermath was quiet, almost anticlimactic after the confrontation. Marshal Dawes arranged for Thorn to be transported to Prescott to face charges, both old and new. The threat that had loomed over Ilara for so long was finally, truly, neutralized. As they stepped out of the gilded cage and into the sunlight, Ilara took a deep breath, as if tasting freedom for the first time. Chance, still patiently waiting at the hitching post, whickered softly as she approached, nuzzling her hand. She leaned her forehead against his warm neck for a long moment, a silent communion of gratitude passing between them. Silas watched them, a profound sense of relief washing over him. The weight he had been carrying, the responsibility for her safety, felt lighter now. He knew there would be talk, both in Blackstone and back in Redemption. Some might still call Ilara a horse thief or question his methods, but he also knew that he had done the right thing. He had stood for justice, not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. "Thank you, Silas," Ilara said, turning to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You saved my life. You gave me back my freedom." "You saved your own life, Ilara," he corrected gently. "You found the courage to flee and the strength to face him. I just opened a door or two." They began the ride back to Redemption in a mood far different from their journey out. The silence now was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The harsh landscape seemed less threatening, imbued with a subtle beauty Ilara hadn't been able to see before. As they rode, Silas found himself thinking about the future, not just for Ilara, but for himself. The quiet solitude of his life, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a void. Ilara's presence, her quiet resilience, her emerging warmth, had filled a space he hadn't even realized was empty. When they arrived back in Redemption, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The town seemed quieter, more peaceful. Mrs. Henderson, from her usual post at the general store window, gave them a long, searching look, but there was less judgment in her eyes now, perhaps a grudging respect. News of Thorne's arrest and Ilara's bravery would have undoubtedly preceded them, carried by the ever-active grapevine. Silas helped Ilara dismount in front of the jailhouse. She stood for a moment, looking at the small, unassuming building that had been her sanctuary. "What will you do now?" Silas asked, his voice carefully neutral, though his heart was anything but. Ilara looked at him, a tentative smile playing on her lips. I don't know. For the first time in a long time I have choices." She paused. Perhaps I could stay in Redemption for a while. If that's all right, I could find work. I'm a good seamstress, and I can cook and clean." A slow smile spread across Silas's face. "I think Redemption could use a good seamstress," he said. "And perhaps the marshal's office could use a permanent cook. The current one is terrible." Ilara laughed, a genuine, light-hearted sound that seemed to chase away the last of the shadows. "Is he now?" "He is," Silas affirmed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He saw the hope in her gaze, the tentative promise of a new beginning. He knew there would be challenges, adjustments. Healing took time. But looking at Ilara, standing there in the fading light, her spirit unbowed, her future stretching before her like the open prairie, he felt a sense of rightness, a deep and abiding peace. He had followed the law, but it was compassion that had led him here, to this moment, to this woman who had stolen his horse, and, in doing so, had inadvertently shown him the way back to his own heart. He watched her turn to Chance, her hand gentle on the horse's flank, the same horse that had carried her away from terror and into his life. The law had been his guide, but kindness had paved the path to a future he hadn't dared to imagine. The sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across Redemption's dusty street. Inside the small marshal's office, a single lamp glows, illuminating two figures. Ilara carefully folds a piece of fabric, a remnant from a mending job, while Silas McBride watches her, a quiet contentment on his face. The threat of Thorne is gone, replaced by a fragile, hopeful peace. The journey was fraught with peril, a stolen horse leading to an unexpected sanctuary, a kind lawman choosing compassion over condemnation. Ilara, once a fugitive fleeing cruelty, now stands on the precipice of a new life, her strength forged in adversity, her spirit rekindled by an unexpected ally. And Silas, the stoic lawman, finds his once solitary world enriched by her presence, his understanding of justice deepened by the courage of one woman. The stolen horse, Chance, rests peacefully in the corral, a silent testament to the desperate flight that brought two disparate souls together, forging a bond of resilience and quiet hope under the vast western sky. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.